The hunter trudged through the swampy forest, mud clinging to his boots like grasping hands. The trees above stood in ranks, unmoving, unchanging, unswaying. The muggy air, too, was stale, without breath. Moss climbed the trunks in thick drapery, lichen consumed the rocks, and the ground lay matted with rotting leaves. Water skippers traced their circles over stagnant pools, ripples colliding, folding back into themselves. There was no meat here. Only roaches, swarming in the canopy and skittering through the leaf mold, each insect devouring what little decay remained. Scraps feeding on scraps feeding on scraps, he thought, hunger filling his cavernous form. His pack dragged on him until his knees trembled. Water seeped into his boots and gnawed at the skin of his feet, raw and softening, step after step. At last he gave in. It was reasonable, he reckoned, to await prey, to let the forest feed him as it did the animals, as it did the roaches, as it did the moss. He lowered himself into the muck. With slow hands he smeared soil and damp leaves across his body, a carcass dressing itself for burial. Rifled cradled, eyes fixed on the tree-line, he pressed his chest flat against the earth and waited. The forest lay as still as he did. No wind, no sound but the faint crawl of life. Beneath his nose an ant wandered in endless spirals, instinct guiding him. Here the ant would starve, thought the hunter. Here is why I must not move. His gaze followed the ant until the ache in his eyes forced him away. Only then did he notice the shift in the tree-line. A shadow stirred, half hidden in the foliage. His mouth flooded with saliva. His hand shook as he steadied the rifle, his heart quickening, prey at last. He took aim at the dark shape, and fired. The cry of a man rang through the forest and echoed back. The hunter dragged himself from the mud, leaf litter clinging, and staggered toward the sound. On the ground lay a stranger, his pack burst open. Only a bedroll and a dull knife spilled into the dirt. He writhed in pain, fists pounding the soil, teeth biting into his own tongue. Blood soaked his leg where the shot had torn through, and his hands clawed at his blonde hair until it matted red. The hunter froze, then forced himself forward. From his own pack he unwound a coil of twine, binding it tight around the bleeding limb. The nomad snarled at him through gritted teeth before sinking weakly against the earth as the blood slowed. When the bleeding ceased, he was unconscious. The hunter studied him in silence. He gazed guiltlessly upon his form. No man so full could be innocent. No man could walk these woods and live, unless he had already traded his purity for meat. No, thought the hunter, not here. Night fell. The nomad awoke in fever, his limbs thrashing, voice cracked. He tried to stand, but his leg betrayed him. With a cry he lunged at the hunter, who struck him back down and lashed his wrists to the trunk of a rotted tree. The nomad glared, eyes burning with hatred, before falling into unwilling sleep. Soon the hunter followed. A pale dawn came. The wound had turned, pus bubbling from the thigh, the stench thick in the air. His eyes flew open and he began to babble senselessly. The forest feeds and is fed upon. Greenery is not but a man. Men are green too, but the green men are not. Green men come from the forest yet are not of the forest. My mother told me of a man from the forest. Over the moon. Over the moon. My mother said he is not human. My mother said he is greater and vaster than imagination. I killed a man once. What does the fat taste of? First yellow, then green, then gray, then black. Soon enough it is dirt. Soon enough I will be dirt too. My mother said he is the forest. He is still living, you know. He will never stop living. As long as I live and you live and he lives and she lives, he will live. My father is not a ghost, but he is. He is a spiral. Over the moon is a pasture. "The man tasted of beef," said my mother. "What is beef?" "Nothing you would know." "I know it was good, that is all I know." The forest feeds the spirit, and the spirit feeds the forest. Death reaps, death reaps, death reaps, death reaps death. The hunter pressed him down into the mud until it took his breath. The hunter crouched by his fire, a bowl of thin broth steaming in his hands. The hut, its clay walls crumbling, filled with the acrid scent of oak smoke. Strips of meat dangled above the floorboards, safe from the prowling roaches. He stirred with a sharpened stick, spearing a dark strip and chewing it down. The flesh was dry, fibrous, the faint herbs doing little to mask the bitterness. He picked his teeth with the stick. A single blonde strand clung between his molars. He spat it into the fire, where it curled and vanished. The smoke thickened, drifting sideways instead of up, funneling toward his face. He coughed, and pushed himself outside into the night. The air was stale, unmoving. Roaches scuttled over his bare foot and he jerked back, but more poured from the shadows, a crawling line unbroken, each insect pressing after the one before it. He laced his boots and followed. Hunger and habit told him the trail must lead to food. The forest feeds and is fed upon, he thought, as the line carried him over briar and mud, through gullies, through valleys and hills. The night gave way slowly to dawn. Over the tree-line he saw gray threads weaving through the branches, curling in spirals around the trunks, dispersing skyward in twisting wisps. The roaches quickened, and he jogged to keep pace, though their numbers stretched beyond sight. At last, the smoke rose from a shape he knew. His hut. The line of insects met itself at the doorway, circling, folding into its own beginning. An unbroken stream, looping endlessly, their bodies carving a shallow channel into the earth as they passed. The hunter stood and watched in awe. Inside, the meat hung untouched. The jerky dwindled day by day until only a handful of strips clung to the boards. After 2 moons, but a bowl's worth remained. He lowered the last of them into a clay pot, let the water come to boil, and waited as the smell rose, bitter, foul, more rot than food. When it cooled, he drank. A strip slipped against his teeth, slimy and raw. His stomach clenched, and he spat it onto the ground. The flesh glistened pink. Raw. Driven by hunger, he speared it again and held it over the embers until his hand ached from the heat. It did not change. He thrust it into the fire. Ash blackened its skin, but beneath, the flesh still shone pale. He buried it in the mud outside. He tried his hand at snares again. He carefully bound twine and wood, crafting delicate traps, each set along a trail no creature had walked in days. He walked them all the next morning, half a day spent in silence. At once a sound. Stones striking earth. His heart quickened. He rushed toward it, but the brush stirred as something small fled into shadow. He cursed aloud and went to reset the trap. Blood stained the soil, a dent made in the earth, a trail leading into the thicket. Yet the stone hung in the air, tripwire unbroken, the trap still waiting. On a thorn, tangled in the bloody path, a strand of blonde hair glistened wetly. He turned homeward beaten. But the path was wrong. His own footprints lay ahead of him, doubling back, circling into themselves. He followed them until the hut rose before him again, though he had never turned. He stepped inside. Strips of meat hung above the floorboards. The next morning, again, he boiled them. Again, they gleamed raw. Again, he buried them. Again, he walked the traps. Again, the same sound, the same stone, the same blonde hair tangled in the thorn. Bones surfaced from the mud in crescents and rings, roaches circling them in tireless procession. The insects' paths were etched into the ground. He stepped into one, and walked until he recognized his own hut before him again. The sound of chewing rose. He froze. In his periphery, a figure, its form caked in mud, pale strands of blonde hair piercing the filth, bent over a bone. The hunter raised his hands in a gesture of truce and inched forward. But as quickly as the critter had fled, the figure slipped back into the forest. Only its imprint remained, pressed into the wet earth where it had stood. Around the print, roaches moved in perfect circles, their bodies tracing the loop again and again and again. The hunter woke to footsteps. His own. Pressed into the soil ahead of him, circling, circling, circling. He bent to touch one and felt the print still warm. His heel fit perfectly. He followed until he was back where he began. The days passed. He trudged through swamp, lay in mud, boiled strips of meat that were not meat. He buried himself, he waited, he watched the tree lean. When he raised his rifle, no prey came. Only his own shadow, half hidden. At dusk he saw the figure again. This time it did not vanish. It stood close enough that he could see the ribs rising, falling, rising, falling. Mud sealed its eyes. Blonde hair hung damp across its skull. Its lips moved, yet the sound came from his own throat. Death reaps, death reaps, death reaps, death reaps. He pressed his hands to his mouth to muffle the sound, but still the words spilled out, still the chant circled the air. The figure opened its jaw, and soil poured from his own tongue. He tasted iron, moss, rot. His knees buckled. The forest leaned nearer, wheezing. The roaches drew rings around him, each loop smaller, tighter, pressing him into the muck. He tried to rise, but the figure overlapped him, skin to skin, hair to hair, mud to mud, until there was no seam. He gasped. The forest gasped. The chant continued, though no one spoke. When his eyes opened, he was walking. Hunger tore through him. His boots dragged in muck. Above, the trees stood unmoving, unchanging, unswaying. Ripples folded across stagnant pools, insects tracing their endless spirals. The hunter trudged through the swampy forest.